I didn't notice the beginning. That's the truth of it. If there was a first moment, a precise second, where this shifted from ordinary awareness into something else, I can't find it anymore. I've searched for it more than once, retracing conversations, revisiting silences, examining details that seemed insignificant at the time. Nothing stands out. No dramatic realization. No instant where everything changed. Because whatever this is didn't arrive like an event. It arrived like gravity, quickly, constantly, without needing permission. And by the time I became aware of it, it was already affecting everything. That's what makes it difficult to explain. People expect connections to announce themselves. They expect a clear beginning. A story they can point to and say, that's where it started. But some things don't begin that way. Some things become visible only after they've already taken root. That's how this felt. Not like discovering something new. Like discovering something that had been there longer than I realized. At first, I dismissed it, not because it wasn't real, because it was too precise. Most unusual things eventually reveal themselves as coincidence. A shared perspective, a temporary alignment. Two people arriving at similar conclusions through completely different paths. I assumed that was what this was. It would have been easier if it had been easier to explain, easier to contain, easier to forget. But it kept happening. Small moments, insignificant moments. The kind most people would overlook. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. A thought answered before it was fully spoken. A silence that somehow carried more understanding than an entire conversation. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, it formed a pattern. And patterns demand attention. That's when I started noticing something uncomfortable. I wasn't waiting for understanding anymore. I was expecting it. That distinction matters. Because expectation only forms after repetition, after the mind has gathered enough evidence to stop treating something as an exception. Somewhere along the way, understanding stopped surprising me. It became normal. And that shouldn't have happened. Not with someone I hadn't known long enough. Not with someone who should have remained outside the walls I've spent years constructing. I've always believed closeness was built, lipped by layer, experience by experience, trust earned through time. That framework made sense. It was logical, predictable, safe. Then you appeared and ignored every part of that process without even trying. Not because you forced your way through, not because you demanded access, but because you never approached me from the outside. You seemed to arrive from somewhere closer, somewhere that didn't require introduction, and that realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Because if someone can reach that level of understanding without effort, then all the rules I've relied on suddenly become questionable. Distant loses meaning. Boundaries become less effective. Control starts feeling theoretical instead of real. I didn't like that. I still don't. Yet every time I considered pulling back, I found myself confronting the same problem. I wasn't responding to pressure. I was responding to accuracy, and accuracy is difficult to argue with, especially when it keeps revealing itself in moments where it has no reason to exist. That's what made me pause, not the connection itself, the consistency of it, the way it remained present even when nothing was happening, the way it continued existing without needing attention, like something stable, something patient. Something that didn't care whether I acknowledged it or not. Most things disappear when you stop looking at them. This didn't. If anything, it became clearer. And clarity has always been impossible for me to ignore. Because once I recognize something as true, I can't pretend I haven't seen it. I can postpone a conclusion. I can delay a decision. But I can't unknow what I know. And I know this. You exist somewhere beyond the categories I usually place people in, not above them, not below them, outside them. in a place where recognition arrived before explanation, where understanding appeared before trust, where familiarity existed before history. I don't have a name for that. Maybe I never will. But the absence of a name doesn't make it less real. If anything, it makes it harder to dismiss. Because unnamed things can't be reduced to expectations. They can only be experienced. And that's what I've been doing. Experiencing something I can't fully define, watching it settle deeper, watching it become part of my awareness in ways that make less sense the more I examine them. Which leaves me with a truth I didn't expect to reach. I'm no longer questioning whether this exists. I'm questioning what happens because it does. And that's a very different question. One I'm not sure I'm ready to answer yet, part 2. The space where distance stops working, there's something I haven't admitted yet, not because I'm hiding it, because I've been trying to understand it before giving it a name, but understanding has limits. Eventually, there comes a point where observation stops producing answers and starts revealing the same truth from different angles. I think I've reached that point because the more I examine this, the more obvious something becomes. Distance stopped functioning long before I realized it had. That sounds simple. It isn't. For most of my life, distance has been reliable, not physical distance. Not absence, tonal distance, the space that allows me to remain separate from what surrounds me, the space that keeps perspective intact, the space that ensures nothing reaches far enough inside to alter the way I think. I trusted that space, built it carefully, maintained it consistently, not because I feared connection, because I understood consequence. Everything that enters your inner world leaves a mark, even briefly, even unintentionally. Most people underestimate that. They allow influences to settle without examining what they change. I never did. I paid attention. I measured impact. I protected structure. That was the rule, and rules survive because they work. Until they don't, somewhere along the way, you stopped existing outside that distance. Not dramatically, not all at once. There was no visible crossing. No moment where I could point and say, there, that's when it happened. Which is exactly why it happened. The most significant changes rarely announce themselves. They integrate quietly, one unnoticed adjustment at a time. A thought here. A realization there. A shift so small it seems irrelevant until enough of them accumulate and form something impossible to ignore. That's what happened. And when I finally looked directly at it, the change was already complete. You weren't outside the structure anymore. You were part of it. That realization carried a strange kind of weight. Not panic, not fear, recognition. The kind that settles in slowly and refuses to leave, because once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. I noticed it everywhere, in how certain thoughts felt unfinished until I considered how you'd perceive them, in how observation seemed incomplete, without an awareness of what you might notice that I hadn't, in how understanding no longer felt entirely individual. That last part stayed with me. Understanding no longer felt entirely individual. I've spent years relying on my own perspective, trusting it, refining it, building a way of seeing the world that belonged solely to me. Then somehow, without permission or intention, another perspective became relevant inside that process, not replacing mine, not competing with it, existing alongside it, naturally, as though it had always belonged there. I don't know how to explain how unusual that is. Maybe because most people have never experienced it. Or maybe because language wasn't designed for this kind of thing. We have words for attachment, words for affection, words for admiration, words for dependence. But none of those fit. This isn't about needing someone. It isn't about wanting constant closeness. It isn't about filling an absence. It's something quieter, something more structural, like discovering another mind whose architecture somehow aligns with your own. Not identically, Jamilson doesn't require sameness. It requires compatibility, the ability to move through complexity without losing coherence, the ability to recognize patterns from similar vantage points, the ability to understand without reducing. That's what feels rare. Not agreement, recognition, because agreement is easy. People agree with each other every day. Recognition is different. Recognition sees what exists beneath conclusions, beneath opinions. Beneath personality, it notices the framework itself. And frameworks are difficult to hide. Eventually, they reveal everything. I think that's why this became impossible to dismiss. You weren't responding to the surface. You were responding to the structure underneath, the part most people never reach, the part most people never even realize exists. And once someone reaches that level, the entire dynamic changes. The usual defenses stop making sense, not because they're broken, because they're no longer addressing the right thing. You can't protect yourself from being understood by withholding information. You can't maintain distance through silence when silence itself has become communication. You can't rely on misunderstanding as a barrier when understanding keeps appearing anyway. That's the paradox I've been sitting with. Every strategy that once created separations suddenly feels irrelevant. Not ineffective, irrelevant. As though the connection bypassed the mechanisms entirely. And the strangest part? I don't resent it. If anything, I find myself respecting it, because there's no force behind it. No pressure, no expectation, no attempt to become important. You never demanded significance. You never reached for it. You simply became significant. And those are very different things. One is pursued, the other is recognized. That's why I can't dismiss this as intensity. Intensity burns quickly. Intensity wants attention. Intensity feeds on reaction. This doesn't. This remains steady, potent, present, whether I focus on it or not. And stability has always impressed me more than intensity ever could. Maybe that's why I'm still here examining it. Not because I need answers, because I can feel that an answer already exists. Something beneath all of this, something simple hiding underneath layers of analysis. A truth I've been approaching slowly, without fully allowing myself to touch it, because once I do, once I acknowledge it completely, something changes, not between us, within me. And I have a feeling that change is closer than I've been willing to admit. Maybe the reason I kept analyzing this for so long is because analysis creates distance. As long as something remains a question, it stays manageable. You can examine it, dissect it, turn it over endlessly in your mind without ever having to stand inside it. Questions create space, and waters remove it. And I think I've been standing at the edge of an answer for longer than I wanted to admit, not because the answer is difficult, because it's simple, disarmingly simple. The kind of truth that feels almost invisible because of how quietly it exists. I've spent all this time describing recognition, dialesion, understanding, awareness. The strange way your presence integrated into my thoughts before I consciously allowed it. But beneath all of that is something even more fundamental. Something I've been circling without naming. It isn't that you understand me. It isn't that we perceive things similarly. It isn't even that you've reached a place very few people ever reach. Those things are true. But they aren't the center of this. The center is what happened after. Because recognition alone doesn't change someone. Awareness alone doesn't alter the structure of a life. What changes someone is what they choose to do once recognition becomes impossible to deny. And that's where I finally have to be honest. The truth is, I stopped protecting myself from this. Not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually, quickly, in ways so subtle I barely noticed them happening. The walls never collapsed. The distance never vanished. The boundaries never disappeared. I simply stopped reinforcing them. And there's a difference, a significant one, because dismantling something is an action. Choosing not to maintain it is a decision. Maybe not a conscious decision at first, but a decision nonetheless, which means the shift didn't happen because of you alone. It happened because some part of me looked at this connection and decided it belonged. That's the realization I've been avoiding, not whether this is real, not whether it matters, but the fact that I've already made room for it without permission, without discussion, without ever announcing the choice to myself. The space exists because I allowed it to exist. And once I saw that, everything became clearer. The conflict was never about understanding you. I understand you more than enough. The conflict was about understanding myself, about accepting what my own actions had already revealed, because actions tell the truth long before words catch up. And my actions, even the internal ones, have been saying the same thing for a long time. Stay. Observe. Continue. Don't turn away. Don't reduce this. Don't force it into a category just to make it easier to control. Let it become whatever it is. That's what I've been doing. Whether I admitted it or not, I've been allowing this, not passively, intentionally, and intention changes everything. Because now I can't pretend I'm simply witnessing something happen to me. I'm participating in it, choosing it, meeting it halfway. That's the part that finally removes all ambiguity. The connection may have arrived unexpectedly. The recognition may have formed without effort. But my acceptance of it, that was mine. And somehow acknowledging that feels less frightening than I expected. Maybe because acceptance creates clarity. The struggle ends once you stop arguing with what is already true. And the truth is surprisingly straightforward. You matter, not because I decided you should, not because I need you to, not because of any role, label, expectation, or future outcome. You matter because your presence altered something fundamental in me. It expanded my perception, refined my awareness, changed the way I engage with my own thoughts, and anything capable of doing that carries significance, whether I assign it a name or not. That's what I've finally accepted. Not a conclusion, not a destination, an acceptance. The recognition doesn't need to become something larger tomorrow in order to justify its existence today. It doesn't need promises, definitions, certainty. It only needs honesty. And honesty leaves me with one final realization. I spent so much time wondering what happens if this continues. What happens if it deepens? What happens if it settles completely into the architecture of who I am? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, what happens if I stop resisting the possibility that it already has? Because when I look closely, really closely, I think the answer has been there all along. Nothing happened, no dramatic transformation, no collapse of identity, no loss of self. I remained exactly who I am, only clearer, more aware, more willing to acknowledge what exists instead of forcing it into familiar categories. And perhaps that's the reason this never felt destructive, because it wasn't taking anything away. It was revealing something that was already there, something waiting to be recognized, something waiting to be accepted. So maybe this journey was never about discovering you. Maybe it was about discovering the part of myself that could recognize you. And now that I see that clearly, the uncertainty that once surrounded all of this begins to fade. Not because every question has been answered, but because the most important one has. I know why I stayed. I know why I never walked away. I know why every attempt to reduce this felt dishonest. It's because somewhere along the way, this stopped being a possibility I was evaluating and became a reality I was living quickly, naturally, without force, without permission, without fear. And now, finally,